Hello everyone, I hope and pray that you are fine wherever you are. Welcome again to this platform where we discuss the current, future issues of Kenya, Africa and the world. And in today's session, I want us to talk about Agenda 2063, its main provisions, the current achievements, the factors that undermine the achievement of the goals, and what Africa and Africans can do to ensure that the goals are achieved. Now, over the years, African countries have been developing strategic plans containing objectives and goals to be attained within specified number of years. For example, Kenya developed its Vision 2030 with the vision statement to become a globally competitive and prosperous country with a high quality of life. Uganda developed Vision 2035 with the commitment to transform the society from peasant to a modern prosperous country. Tanzania developed Vision 2025 with the commitment to maintain a high quality of life anchored on peace, stability, unity, and good governance, rule of law, resilient economy, and competitiveness. Rwanda developed Vision 2020 and Burundi developed Vision 2025. Now, these visions entail strategic plans, strategic frameworks that African countries intend to achieve within some specified number of years. Africa as a continent is no exception to the development of strategic plans. In fact, Africa for the first time in 1963 developed a strategic plan which was to see the continent united in the coming years. African founding fathers, when they were sitting in Addis Ababa in 1963, they envisioned a united Africa. And these visions, close to 50 years or 70 years since 1963, some of them have been attained, while some of them are yet to be attained. For the second time, modern day African founding fathers united again in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in 2015, and they designed a plan. They developed a strategic plan for Africa to achieve by the year 2063. And the founding fathers, the modern day founding fathers, labeled this plan Agenda 2063. Now, Agenda 2063 has several provisions. These provisions are classified into headings, topics. I will not talk about all the subheadings of Agenda 2063, but I just want to talk about a very critical section of this strategic plan. Now, within Agenda 2063, there is the section for well-governed, peaceful, and cultural-centric Africa in a global context. Now, in this section, the modern day founding fathers who designed Agenda 2063 noted specific provisions that Africa needed to achieve by the year 2063. And these provisions are numerous, and I will not talk about all of them, but I will just select a few and I will rate them according to Africa's performance currently, and I will identify the factors that limit the achievement of these provisions. Then I will also give directions in my own view on what Africa and Africans can do to ensure that the provisions are adequately achieved. Now, one of the provisions in the section well-governed, peaceful, and cultural-centric Africa in a global context as part of Agenda 2063 is that at least 7 out of 10 persons in every member state of the Union will perceive elections to be free, fair, and credible. Democratic institutions, processes, and leaders accountable, the judiciary impartial and independent, and the legislature independent and key component of the national governance process. Now, all what this provision is saying is that by 2063, at least 7 out of 10 persons in every member state of the African Union will perceive elections to be free, fair, and credible. I want to rate the achievement of this provision. Out of 10, I will give it, let me say, 5. 5 out of 10. Why am I rating the perception of African elections to be free, fair, and credible? Why am I rating it 5 out of 10? Now, I want to acknowledge and admit the fact that Africa has progressed over the years, measured from 1963 to the present in terms of elections. Today, many African countries, almost all African countries, are under democratic governments. And in democratic governments, one of the key provisions is the periodic elections. Most African countries hold elections after every 5 years. These elections are well funded. They have knowledgeable personnel and they attract world attention. But despite all this, African elections remain hotly contested. African elections remain hotly contested, and the hot contests sometimes force the leaders and the bodies overseeing these elections to engage in, let me say, undemocratic practices that undermine the freedom, fairness, and credibility of these elections. In my country, Kenya, today, if you conduct a public interview, public survey within the streets or on social media, and ask citizens if they perceive the elections done in the country to be free, fair, and credible elections, I am very sure, and I must warmly admit that 7 out of 10 of these people will tell you that Kenyan elections are not free, fair, and credible. This is not the case in Kenya only. Go to Uganda. They will tell you the same thing. Many of the people, citizens there, will tell you that their elections, they believe, are not free, fair, and credible. And for these reasons, I rate Africa's performance in ensuring free, fair, and credible elections as part of the provisions of Agenda 2063, 5 out of 10. Because as I speak now, many Africans and many African countries are yet to deliver free, fair, and credible elections. This is informed by the context of my country, Kenya, and from the various readings, various reports from African countries, noting that their elections, despite huge investments, are still not free, fair, and credible. What is undermining the achievement of free, fair, and credible elections in Africa? I want to say that corruption is one of the key factors that undermines the delivery of free, fair, and credible elections. It is common in most African countries. It is common to hear citizens and elites talking about corrupt African leaders. It is common to hear citizens and elites talk about corruption within the election bodies. Now, corruption within the election bodies or the institutions overseeing elections in African countries makes the freedom, fairness, and credibility of these elections, puts them into question. I want to talk about a second provision of Agenda 2063 under the bracket of well-governed, peaceful, and cultural-centric Africa in a global context. And this provision states, and I quote, democratic values and culture as enshrined in the African governance architecture would have been entrenched by 2063, or let me say 2023. Democratic values and cultures. I want to laud African countries and I want to laud African governments for their progress, for the miles that they have taken, the steps that they have taken to ensure that African countries function and thrive under democracies. Democracy, to some, and to me partly, is a perfect form of governance. Why? Mainly because democracy protects and upholds the rights and freedoms of citizens. Many African countries have adopted new constitutions, and these new constitutions contain a section known as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights contains the rights and freedoms of every citizen. It gives, protects, and umbrellas citizens, children, women, men, and all other populations in African countries. The new constitutions give citizens a power and a strong voice in their government. Citizens have a responsibility to make and break their governments. To me, the ability of these constitutions to protect and uphold the rights and freedoms of citizens is a significant progress for African countries. And in this perspective, I give Africa and African countries, let me say, an 8/10 rating in terms of democratic values and culture. Why? Because most African countries have adopted new constitutions that contain the Bill of Rights, and this Bill of Rights protects and upholds the rights and freedoms of individual citizens. To this end, Africa and Africans have edged closer to achieving this Agenda 2063 provision. I want to talk about another provision of well-governed, peaceful, and cultural-centric Africa in a global context within Agenda 2063, and this provision says that all guns would have been silenced by 2020. And I repeat that. All guns would have been silenced by 2020. Now, this provision of the Agenda 2063 states clearly that by 2020, all guns in Africa and African countries would have been silent. This provision means that peace shall have been attained in Africa by 2020. Many will agree with me. and I believe many share my thoughts, my statements, and my conclusions that Africa and African countries are far away from silencing their guns. Why am I saying this? Remember, this Agenda 2063 structural frameworks or strategic framework was developed in 2015, and they predicted that 5 years from then, 2020, the guns in Africa shall have been silenced. This means that there would be sustained peace in Africa by 2020. We are in 2023, and what we see in Africa is the complete opposite of what Agenda 2063 envisioned. Today, people are fighting in Sudan. Today, people are fighting in Somalia. People are fighting in Ethiopia. The DR Congolese are fighting. Central African Republic is fighting. Mali is fighting. Burkina Faso is fighting. Libya is fighting. And recently, Niger, or what some people may call Niger, is fighting. And Niger is currently under a coup. With these examples that I have given, and I have provided examples from North Africa, from East Africa, from Central Africa, from West Africa, and from South Africa, it is clearly seen that African guns are never silent, and they will never be silent anytime soon. We are seeing an Africa where countries fighting are added to the list every day. More African countries are fighting each and every day. This is contrary to what Agenda 2063 envisioned. Agenda 2063 envisioned that by 2020, all guns in Africa shall have been silenced. But what we see in Africa today is a continent where there are constant conflicts, a continent where the citizens are fighting the government, the citizens and the governments are fighting extremists, the citizens and the governments are fighting foreign governments. In my rating, I rate the achievement of this provision in Africa 3 out of 10. Why am I rating African progress in silencing guns by 2020 3 out of 10? I have seen over the years, measured from 2015, that the number of African countries in conflicts increases each and every day instead of decreasing. If the trend was a decrease, if there was a decrease in the number of African countries with experiencing conflicts currently, then I would have rated the progress 7 or 6 out of 10. But since the number of African countries embroiled in conflicts keeps on increasing each and every day in Africa, I will rate the achievement of this provision 3 out of 10. I want us to move to another provision, and this provision states that all member states of the African Union or the Union will have in place local and national mechanisms for conflict prevention and resolution. This provision of Agenda 2063 under well-governed, peaceful, and cultural-centric Africa in a global context required African countries, individual African states, sovereign African states to have in place local and national mechanisms for conflict prevention and resolution. I want to say that to some extent, Africa has been able to achieve this goal. Many African countries currently have local and national mechanisms for conflict prevention and resolution. African countries have bodies that ensure that conflicts are adequately resolved within their national boundaries. I am seeing a progress in my country, Kenya. I am seeing a progress in Uganda. I am seeing a progress in Tanzania. I am seeing notable progress in Rwanda. I am seeing notable progress in South Africa. I am seeing notable progress in Nigeria and other countries. But at the same time, I must say that I am disappointed with the case of DR Congo. I am disappointed with the case of Central African Republic. I am disappointed with the case of Libya. And I am disappointed with the case of Somalia. Not to forget Sudan, and not to forget Ethiopia and Zimbabwe. These countries are currently having conflicts that, to some extent, in my view, needed to be prevented internally, nationally. The governments in these countries needed to establish extensive frameworks for conflict resolution and prevention in these countries. I want to express my deep disappointment with the happenings in DR Congo. I believe that the government in DR Congo have a responsibility to resolve the conflicts in the country nationally. And if the government is unable to resolve such conflicts, then it must seek Africa's assistance. In my view, Africa's performance in achieving local and national mechanisms for conflict prevention and resolution is, let me say, 7 out of 10. I give it a 7 out of 10 because of the exceptions of DR Congo, Central African Republic, Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and many other African countries that are currently experiencing conflicts. Now, I have assessed Africa's performance, Africa's achievement of Agenda 2063 provisions 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 provisions, which the highest rating that I have given is, let me say, 8. The last provision within the well-governed, peaceful, and cultural-centric Africa in a global context that I will discuss is the requirement that all member states of the Union will have in place a dual citizens program for the diaspora. In the achievement of this provision, I will give Africa a 9 out of 10 because currently we have Africans in diaspora. African countries have been able to recognize their citizens in countries outside Africa. And to me, this is a notable progress and an opportunity for Africa to achieve its Agenda 2063 provisions. I said that in this session I will talk about the provisions of Agenda 2063, and I have discussed these provisions. I have also rated these provisions based on current African performance. I have also given a glimpse on some of the factors that undermine the achievement of these provisions. But added to these factors, I want to state that one of the undermining, limiting factors in Africa that blinds the achievement of Agenda 2063 goals and blinds the achievement and the provisions, the statements and the requirements of the 1963 Founding Fathers Conference in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963 is the political class. I want to say that Africa's failure is largely attributed to the political class. Africa has been failed by politicians, and if Africa is not careful, politicians will continue to plague its performance towards the future. In Africa, we have a bunch of, let me say, professionals who call themselves politicians, whose motive and primary goal is to squander public resources. They rise to power, they acquire political responsibility, and they occupy political offices with the primary objective to amass wealth. These individuals amass wealth selfishly, forgetting to perform their duties to provide for the citizens occupying these African countries. The achievements in Agenda 2063 is largely attributed to the failures of the political class. Politicians have grossly failed Africa and Africans, and politicians will continue to fail Africa and Africans. The current shortcomings in the democratic space, the current shortcomings in the freedom, fairness, and credibility of African elections, the current shortcomings experienced in the silencing of guns in Africa, and the current shortcomings experienced or attributed to conflict prevention and resolution in Africa is attributed largely to the failures of the political class. To this end, I must now ask the question: what should Africa and what should Africans do to ensure that Agenda 2063 provisions are achieved? My formula is very simple. And straightforward. I have a two-method approach for ensuring that Africa achieves Agenda 2063. Remember, I want us to remember that Agenda 2063 envisions that by the year 2030 there will be consensus on the form of the continental unity and its underlying institutions. And by 2045, all legal measures required for the formation of a united Africa will be in place with all its institutions by 2045. One of my suggestions for ensuring that Africa achieves Agenda 2063 is based on African unity. You remember the founding fathers in 1963 implored Africans and African leaders, African governments, and individual sovereign African states to unite for positive performance to be recorded. The founding fathers noted that Africa's success was based on unity. I want to reiterate the same statements, and I want to argue and I want to emphasize that Africa's success, Africa's ability to achieve Agenda 2063 is based on unity. If African countries are committed to creating a united Africa, then Agenda 2063 provisions will be easily achieved. My second suggestion and my second proposal for the successful achievement of Agenda 2063 provisions is for Africans, and I want to talk about the electorate, African electorates, to choose responsible, and I mean responsible leaders. I have said that one of the primary problems of Africa, one of the key factors that undermines progress in Africa, is the political class. Africans have a duty to choose the best leaders to lead their countries. Over the years, Africans have been having a strong affection for thieves. Africans have been having a strong affection for corrupt leaders to occupy political offices. And I want to say that Africans, including me, have a very strong affinity for leaders who are corrupt. I don't know whether Africans are impressed, are happy when corrupt leaders lead them, occupy political offices. I want to urge Africans that they have a central responsibility to ensure that the leaders occupying political offices are free of corruption. They must ensure that the leaders that they elect to occupy political offices are responsible. They must ensure that these leaders are those with high integrity. When leaders with values, when leaders who are responsible, when leaders who are committed to working for citizens occupy political offices, then African progress, I want to say, is looming. African countries and Africans have a responsibility to ensure that these two suggestions, these two proposals are implemented. And if these two proposals are actively and accurately implemented in African countries, then I see Africa edging closer to achieving the Agenda 2063 provisions. And I want to repeat that Agenda 2063 can be achieved if Africa is united and if Africans choose leaders who are responsible and free of corruption. I want to urge African countries and I want to urge sovereign African governments that it is never late. The achievement of Agenda 2063 provisions is never late. I want to commend African countries and say that they are on the right track. African countries still have a responsibility to ensure that Agenda 2063 provisions are acutely met. And until then, Africans have a date Africans have a date with the political class, and Africans have a date with continental unity. Agenda 2063 provisions must be realized, and the provisions of Agenda 2063 can be realized when Africa is united and when Africans choose the right leaders to lead them. Thank you everyone, and see you again.